ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, and friends gathered in pursuit of understanding and justice, we convene at a moment of deep consequence in the story of sovereign wealth, international order, and the shifting architecture of global influence. The subject before us concerns the contest that has unfolded around one of the world's most sensitive and strategic resources. It is a contest that is at once economic, political, military, and moral. It forces us to confront questions about sovereignty and self-determination, about the responsibilities of external powers, and about the shape of a world in which resource extraction can determine the balance of regional security and international relations. At the center of this complex narrative is a nation whose subterranean wealth has long been both a promise of prosperity and a source of external interest. That nation's decision to assert full control over its strategic mineral reserves has generated intense debate, dramatic diplomatic ruptures, and an urgent reordering of alliances. This is not merely a local or regional drama. It is an episode that speaks to the evolving relationship between a powerful external actor and the nations of an entire continent. It is a case study in how resource governance, national dignity, and geopolitical ambition intersect. To understand what has transpired, we must first acknowledge the historical pattern that frames this moment. For decades, international arrangements governing access to strategic minerals have been shaped by unequal bargaining power, legacy agreements signed under conditions far from equitable, and, at times, by an interplay of security arrangements and commercial interests that favored external actors. Those arrangements created a dependency in which host nations received limited rents for resources that were then processed, marketed, and monetized largely outside their borders. The rhetoric of partnership often masked a distribution of benefits that left resource-rich communities and states with marginal shares of the value generated by their own land. In recent years, a rising insistence on resource sovereignty has reframed the conversation. Across the continent, leaders, civil society, and communities have asserted that natural wealth should primarily serve national development priorities. This movement builds on principles of economic justice, historical grievance, and a clear-eyed determination to change the terms of engagement with actors from outside the continent. The immediate flashpoint of the present crisis lies in the decision by a national government to reclaim operational control over its strategic deposit, to revise or revoke prior contractual arrangements, and to manage existing stockpiles under state authority as part of a broader program of national economic reorientation. The result has been a rupture with long-standing external partners, the invocation of legal arbitration, and a flurry of diplomatic and commercial maneuvers by states and companies with long-standing interests in the resource. Those events must be placed within a broader context of regional politics and shifting security considerations. The decision to assert control over strategic reserves came after a period of domestic political upheaval and institutional realignment, during which the balance of domestic power was contested and recalibrated. International partners, particularly those with historical presence and vested commercial stakes, found themselves confronting a new reality. Access and continuity of supply could no longer be presumed. The reaction from those partners included legal challenges, suspension of certain forms of cooperation, and public expressions of concern about the economic and security consequences of abrupt changes in extraction and ownership. At the same time, the national government framed its actions as a restoration of sovereignty and a necessary corrective to arrangements it characterized as unjust and extractive. It is important to emphasize that the nationalization of strategic mineral production was not an impulsive gesture. It followed a deliberate assertion of authority rooted in constitutional prerogatives and economic strategy. The government presented its actions as corrective measures aimed at addressing expired or one-sided agreements, compensating for long-standing grievances over revenue distribution, and ensuring that the control and proceeds from strategic minerals would be harnessed for national development. To many within the country and across neighboring states, this stance represented a refusal to accept a status quo that too often rendered host nations passive suppliers in global value chains. The international response to this policy shift was both immediate and instructive. External actors with historical investments and strategic dependencies registered swift objections. Legal instruments were activated, including arbitration claims before international tribunals. Economic pressure and the threat of sanctions were raised as part of a toolkit aimed at compelling a different path. At the same time, other global actors whose commercial and strategic posture differs from that of the traditional partners offered technical cooperation, alternative financing, and new commercial arrangements. This rapid appearance of alternative partners underscored a new geopolitical reality. When traditional avenues of supply and influence are closed, other states and commercial networks can step forward to fill the vacuum. The net effect is a competition not only for resources, but for influence, technological capacity, and the legitimacy of different models of international engagement. The stakes in this contest are not merely the price of a ton of ore or the volume of exports. Strategic minerals occupy a peculiar place in modern geopolitics because of their dual-use potential and their importance for energy and defense sectors in a number of advanced industrial states. Control over supply lines and stockpiles confers leverage that can translate into bargaining power on other matters of foreign policy and security cooperation. For the host nation, the reclamation of control over stockpiles and the revocation or renegotiation of contracts is premised on the notion that a sovereign government has both the right and the obligation to ensure that the exploitation of its subsoil resources benefits its people first and foremost. With the invocation of national prerogatives comes a series of hard choices. How will production be governed to meet international safety and environmental standards? How will revenues be managed transparently and equitably to achieve development goals? How will the state ensure that new commercial partners operate under terms that do not replicate the extractive patterns of the past? The answers to these questions will determine whether the assertion of sovereignty yields improved welfare and durable development, or whether it produces new forms of mismanagement and corruption. It is also essential to assess the security dimension. The closure of traditional access routes and the establishment of alternative partnerships have raised concerns among some external actors about supply security and regional stability. These concerns have manifested in the repositioning of military assets in proximate waters and in heightened surveillance activities. Such measures, while presented as precautions, also convey signals of strategic intent and can increase the risk of miscalculation. The management of this security dilemma requires careful diplomacy and the construction of transparent mechanisms that address legitimate concerns about non-proliferation, illicit trafficking, and regional insurgency without undermining the sovereign rights of a nation to manage its resources. Equally important is the legal terrain that has emerged. The invocation of arbitration and international legal mechanisms has become a central feature of the dispute. Long-term contractual relationships are being litigated in foray that will interpret clauses, administrative acts, and historical commitments. For investors, these legal avenues are indispensable protections. For the host state, they are also instruments that can be leveraged to assert rights in the face of perceived injustice. The result is a legal contest as consequential as the diplomatic one, with implications for the future of foreign direct investment and the design of contracts in resource sectors. Amid these geopolitical and legal contests, the role of domestic publics cannot be overstated. The assertion of control over strategic reserves resonated powerfully with domestic constituencies who have long felt excluded from the benefits of national wealth. Civil society organizations, local communities, labor unions, and youth movements mobilized to support the government's stance, seeing in it an opportunity to channel revenues toward schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. At the same time, voices calling for caution stressed the need for institutional checks, transparent revenue management, and safeguards for the rights of affected communities. The interplay between popular pressure for national control and the demands of sound governance presents both promise and peril. The economic calculus of nationalization is complex. Revenue projections must account for immediate losses in efficiency or technical capacity that can follow the abrupt replacement of established operators. There are transition costs associated with assuming operational control, including the maintenance of safety protocols and the retention of local technical knowledge. Yet if managed prudently, national control can yield a larger share of the economic rent, enable the integration of processing and value-added activities domestically, and create opportunities for technology transfer and industrial diversification. The magnitude of these gains depends on the quality of governance, the effectiveness of institutional reforms, and the adoption of transparent fiscal frameworks to manage resource windfalls responsibly. Internationally, the episode has accelerated the diversification of partnerships. Where traditional partners have been sidelined or have lost political influence, alternative states and firms have offered cooperation packages that include infrastructure investment, technological assistance, and security hardware. These offerings are attractive for their immediacy and their apparent alignment with sovereign claims to control and value capture. Yet they raise distinct policy questions. Are the terms of these partnerships conducive to long-term development? Do they embed new dependencies? Do they adhere to internationally recognized standards of labor and environmental protection? These are not abstract queries. They bear directly on the lived experience of communities living near extraction sites and on the environmental legacy that future generations will inherit. A principled framework for engagement must, therefore, be advanced. For host states intent on asserting control, this framework should include clear legal and regulatory modernization, robust environmental safeguards, independent revenue oversight bodies, and inclusive mechanisms for community participation. For external partners, it should prioritize transparency, adherence to best practices, and a commitment to technology transfer and local capacity building. For the international community, it should recognize that the equitable governance of natural resources is inseparable from long-term peace and stability. We must also confront the rhetorical dimension of this contest. In public forums, messages of criticism and warnings have often been framed in stark terms. That unilateral expropriation threatens global stability, that punitive measures are justified, or that the state in question has imperiled its own people. Yet such rhetoric risks obscuring the legitimate grievances that underlie the demand for a fairer share of resource benefits. A balanced discourse should separate legitimate concerns about rule of law and investment protections from arguments that conflate national sovereignty with recklessness. Constructive engagement requires an acknowledgement of the historical imbalances that have shaped present grievances, and a willingness to forge new contractual and institutional approaches that reflect contemporary expectations of fairness. This episode should also prompt a rethinking of how international assistance and cooperation are structured. For decades, development programs tied to resource extraction have emphasized capacity building in narrow technical domains but have often neglected the governance architectures necessary to capture and distribute resource revenues equitably. Renewed attention to budgetary transparency, public investment management, and civic oversight can help ensure that resource windfalls translate into tangible improvements in human development. International financial institutions, bilateral partners, and non-governmental organizations have a role to play in supporting these governance capacities, provided their interventions respect sovereignty and prioritize the priorities defined by the host society. From a strategic perspective, the dynamics observed in this case reflect a broader recalibration of influence in a multipolar world. As established partners find their traditional leverage diminished by domestic political changes in partner states, new actors have become prominent suppliers of capital, technology, and security assistance. This pluralization of options gives resource-owning states greater bargaining power, but it also complicates the task of ensuring that agreements adhere to common standards. The presence of multiple external actors competing to offer favorable terms creates opportunities for improved deals, but it also raises the risk that external competition will be leveraged to undercut governance prerequisites. Looking ahead, the sustainability of the newly asserted course of action will depend on several interlocking factors. First, the adoption of transparent, accountable frameworks for revenue management must be prioritized to prevent the repetition of extractive patterns under national control. Second, the development of technical capacity and institutional expertise is essential to manage complex extraction and processing operations safely and efficiently. Third, the forging of diversified partnerships that emphasize local value addition over raw commodity export can generate broader social and economic dividends. Fourth, regional cooperation mechanisms that address cross-border security, environmental protection, and market integration will reduce the vulnerability of individual states to external pressure and help stabilize the region. Finally, the global community should reflect on the normative implications of this moment. If the principle that natural wealth should primarily benefit the citizens of the country in which it is located is to be upheld, international practice must evolve. That evolution requires transparency, respect for legal processes, and the development of equitable models of partnership that do not sacrifice national control for short-term inflows. It calls for the recognition that development and security are interdependent, and that sustainable progress is most likely when local institutions are empowered, when external partners are accountable to shared standards, and when civic voices are included in decisions that affect land, labor, and livelihoods. In closing, the contest over strategic mineral control is more than a dispute between commercial interests and a host state. It is a crucible in which questions about justice, dignity, governance, and the architecture of international relations are being clarified. The outcome will send doctrinal signals to other resource-rich nations about how they can and should manage their assets. It will inform investor calculus about the risks and rewards of investment in contexts where sovereignty is reasserted, and it will shape the lives of citizens whose futures depend on whether their country's wealth is harnessed for development or dissipated in cycles of extraction that reproduce past inequalities. What is required now is a posture of sober statesmanship. External actors should balance their legitimate concerns about contract sanctity and non-proliferation with respect for the political agency of sovereign states. Host countries must pair rightful assertions of sovereignty with rigorous commitments to governance, environmental stewardship, and inclusive development. Regional and international institutions should facilitate dialogue and technical cooperation that reduces the likelihood of conflict and enhances mutual confidence. This moment offers an opportunity. If seized with prudence, transparency, and a commitment to equitable outcomes, it can help inaugurate a new model of resource governance, one in which the primary beneficiaries of natural wealth are the communities and nations where that wealth is found. Such an outcome would not only honor principles of justice, it would also contribute to a more stable, prosperous, and constructive international order. I thank you for your attention to this critical subject, for your engagement with its complexities, and for your willingness to think deeply about the pathways that lead from confrontation to constructive policy solutions. The path forward will not be simple, but it is navigable if honesty, accountability, and a shared commitment to the common good guide the decisions of leaders and citizens alike.